Picture a Tuesday evening in London, October 1940. A woman named Vera is standing at her kitchen sink in Stepney, East London, washing the dinner plates. Her two children are doing homework at the kitchen table behind her. Her husband is at the fire station. He has been working 48-hour shifts since September. The wireless is on. The newsreader is saying something she's already heard 3 times today. Outside, the street is quiet in the specific way that streets in London have been quiet since the blackout regulations came in. No street lights, curtains drawn, the city made deliberately invisible from above. She knows what the quiet means. She has known since the 3rd of September last year, when the Prime Minister's voice came through the wireless and told her that a state of war existed between Britain and Germany, that the quiet before the siren is a different kind of quiet from the quiet that existed before any of this began. She finishes the plates, she fills the flask with tea, she checks that the torch is by the back door, she waits. The siren, when it comes at 20 past 8. It always comes at roughly the same time. The Germans are methodical. She calls the children away from the table. She picks up the bag she packed 2 weeks ago and has repacked every morning since the ration books, the children's birth certificates, the small amount of cash, a change of clothes for each child, the flask. They go through the back door into the garden. The Anderson shelter is a half-buried corrugated steel arch covered in the earth she dug out to sink it. And it smells of that earth and of the damp wool of the blankets inside, and of the particular enclosed darkness of a space where frightened people have spent many nights. She settles the children on the wooden bunk. She pulls the blankets around them. She sits on the opposite bench and listens to the drone of the aircraft building from the east. And she does not think about the plates she did not finish washing, or the homework the children did not finish, or where her husband is. She thinks about the flask. She pours the tea. This is what life in London looked like during the Blitz. Not the version that has been constructed in the decades since, from the photographs of milkmen stepping over rubble and policemen directing traffic past bombed buildings with their helmets still straight, and their expressions compose the version in which the famous British Stoicism appears as a natural condition, rather than as an achievement won daily by ordinary people against pressures that were extraordinary. The real version was more complicated, more frightened, more exhausted, and more human than the myth that was built from it. It was Vera in the Anderson shelter with 2 children and a flask of tea and an absent husband, and 57 consecutive nights ahead of her in which the same sequence, siren, shelter, waiting, all clear, return to a house that was still standing, would repeat itself until repetition itself became its own kind of endurance. London, in September 1940, was a city that had been preparing for war for 2 years and had not, despite those 2 years of preparation, been fully prepared for what war actually looked like when it arrived from the sky above the East End on a Saturday afternoon in early September. The government had been preparing since 1938. Gas masks had been distributed to the entire civilian population, all 43 million of them, including a version for babies that covered the entire infant and required a parent to pump air into it manually, a design that anyone who thought about it for more than a few seconds found deeply alarming. Anderson shelters had been distributed to households with gardens. Evacuation plans had been drawn up, rehearsed, and partially executed in the first weeks of September 1939. Some 3.5 million children, pregnant women, and disabled people had been moved from the cities to the countryside in the largest organized movement of civilians in British history. What the government had been less successful at preparing for was the psychological reality of a city under sustained aerial bombardment, the specific quality of fear that is produced not by a single catastrophic event, but by the nightly repetition of the possibility of catastrophe, week after week, through an autumn and a winter during which the aircraft came back every night, and the question of whether your house would still be standing in the morning was answered anew each time the all-clear sounded. The geography of destruction was not random, though it sometimes felt that way from inside it. The Germans were targeting the Port of London and the industrial infrastructure of the East End, the docks at Wapping and Bermondsey and Rotherhithe, the factories and warehouses and railway yards that fed the British war economy. They hit those targets. They also hit the residential streets surrounding those targets with a comprehensiveness that the word collateral does not adequately describe. Because the streets surrounding the East End docks were not empty spaces around industrial targets. They were Stepney and Poplar and Bermondsey and West Ham densely populated working-class neighborhoods where families had lived for generations, where the streets were narrow and the houses were terraced, and the distance between a warehouse and somebody's bedroom was often measured in meters rather than in the kilometers that the word targeting implied. The people who lived in those streets were not protected by the fact that they were not the intended target. A bomb does not distinguish between a warehouse roof and the roof of the house next to it. The nightly rhythm of life in the Blitz organized itself around the siren with a thoroughness that transformed the structure of ordinary existence in a matter of weeks. Londoners adapted because adaptation was what the situation required, and because human beings are, when circumstances demand it, considerably more adaptable than they believe themselves to be in normal times. The evening meal moved earlier, families ate at 5 or 6 in the evening rather than 7 or 8, because eating before the siren sounded was preferable to eating in the shelter or not eating at all. The children's bedtime disappeared as a concept and was replaced by the shelter's schedule, which was governed not by the clock, but by the all clear. Streets that had been animated with the normal evening activity of a working city, people returning from work, children playing, neighbors standing at garden gates talking, emptied by dusk with a completeness that made London, in the last hour before dark, look like a city from which the population had been quietly and thoroughly removed. The shelters themselves became, over the weeks of October and November, 1,940, something that their designers had not planned for them to become. The Anderson shelter in the back garden was the nighttime home of a family, and families made it into a home with the same instinct for domestication that human beings bring to any space in which they are required to spend extended periods of time. Bunks were fitted with proper mattresses when mattresses could be obtained, or with straw when mattresses could not. Small oil lamps were installed. Tins of biscuits and bottles of water were stored on shelves built from salvaged timber. Photographs were tacked to the curved steel walls. Books appeared. Card games appeared. The specific social world of a family compressed into a small dark space and required to function there through a long night produced its own routines, its own conversations, its own silences. Children did homework by lamplight. Adults read. Some people slept through the bombing with a completeness that amazed those who could not. Some people could not sleep at all and spent the nights in a state of alert attention to every sound, cataloging the thuds and crumps and crashes of the bombs by distance and direction. That one was close, that one was further, that one was very close indeed. The underground stations of the London Tube became the most famous of the Blitz's shelters, though the government had initially resisted their use for that purpose on the grounds that they were needed for the operation of the railway. The Londoners who needed shelter simply bought platform tickets and went down and stayed down. And the government, confronted with a fait accompli on the scale of the London working class, reversed its position. By September 1940, the major underground stations on the deeper lines, Elephant and Castle, Bethnal Green, Aldwych, were sheltering tens of thousands of people every night. The conditions were, by any domestic standard, appalling. The platforms were crowded to the point where movement was difficult. There was no privacy of any kind. The sanitary facilities were inadequate for the numbers using them. The smell of large numbers of human beings in an enclosed underground space after several weeks was not something that any of the people sleeping there had chosen or would have chosen. What the underground offered, in exchange for those conditions, was depth. The platforms of the deep tube lines were 60 feet below street level, which was far enough below the surface that even a direct hit above was unlikely to kill the people sheltering beneath. Depth, in 1940, was worth a great deal. The morning after a raid was its own specific experience, distinct in quality from the night that had preceded it. The all clear sounded a single, sustained note, different in pitch and character from the rising and falling wail of the warning siren, and recognizable to anyone who had heard it as a signal that the aircraft had gone and the counting could begin. People came out of their shelters into streets that were the same streets they had gone into the shelter from, or streets in which something had changed that could not be changed back. The difference between those two kinds of mourning was something that every Londoner in the autumn of 1940 experienced as a form of lottery, whose terms were entirely outside their control. On an unchanged morning, life resumed with a speed that outside observers found striking shops opened, people went to work, children went to school. The bus routes that were still running were used by people who had spent the night in a shelter and were now on their way to offices and factories as if the night had been a night like other nights. On a changed morning, the landscape of the street had been altered in ways that ranged from a broken window to the complete absence of a building that had been there the previous evening. The wardens of the Air Raid Precaution Service, the ARP wardens, whose tin helmets and whistles became one of the visual signatures of the Blitz, were the people who managed the transition between the night and the morning. They had been patrolling the streets during the raids, checking the blackout, directing people to shelters, reporting the locations of bombs to the central control rooms that coordinated the emergency services. In the mornings, they were the first people into the damaged streets, assessing what had happened and what needed to happen next. The warden's job in 1940 was one of the more demanding civilian occupations in the country. It was voluntary, it was unpaid for most of those who did it. It involved spending nights in the open during the bombardment rather than in a shelter. And it required a range of practical skills and human qualities that no training course could fully provide. The wardens, who became the faces of their streets during the Blitz, were, in most cases, ordinary men and women whose previous occupations, shopkeeper, retired teacher, factory foreman, had given no particular indication that they possessed the capacity they demonstrated when the situation required it. The damage to the fabric of London over the course of the Blitz was of a scale that statistics represent imperfectly. More than 1 million London homes were damaged or destroyed. 43,000 civilians were killed across Britain during the Blitz period, approximately half of them in London. The City of London, the ancient commercial heart of the capital, with its churches and its Guildhall, and the buildings that represented the accumulated centuries of London's financial and commercial history, was devastated in the raid of the 29th of December 1940, a night when the Thames was at low tide, and the fire brigade's capacity to draw water from the river was severely limited, and the fires at the incendiary bombs started spread between the tightly packed buildings of the city with a freedom that the water available could not check. The photographs of St. Paul's Cathedral standing above the smoke of that fire, its dome intact above the destruction surrounding it, became the most reproduced image of the entire Blitz. Not because the cathedral's survival was militarily significant, but because it was symbolically necessary. Because a city needs its symbols to survive if the people living through the destruction are to believe that the city itself is surviving. The social life of London during the Blitz contained within it a contradiction that the people living it felt but rarely articulated directly. The bombing created community in the same motion that it destroyed it. Families sheltering together in underground stations developed relationships with the families sheltering next to them that they would not have developed under any other circumstances. Neighbors who had lived adjacent to each other for years without more than a nodding acquaintance became, in the enforced proximity of the shelter, people who knew each other's children's names and each other's fears and each other's habits. The communal feeding centers that the local councils established served not only the function of providing food to people whose kitchens had been destroyed, but the function of providing a public space in which the experience of the Blitz was shared, acknowledged, and made by the simple presence of other people who were having it slightly more bearable. The public house, which stayed open through the Blitz with a determination that the licensing authorities found impressive and the temperance lobby found characteristic, served the same function. People went to the pub not only to drink, but to be in a room with other people who were having the same experience, and to confirm the fact that the pub was open and the beer was available and the landlord was behind the bar, that the situation had not yet succeeded in abolishing the ordinary texture of life. The children of London during the Blitz occupied a position in the city that was unlike anything that had been planned or anticipated. The mass evacuation of September 1939 had removed hundreds of thousands of children from the city. But the months of the Phony War, the period between September 1939 and the spring of 1940, when the expected bombing had not materialized, had led many families to bring their children back. When the real bombing began in September 1940, a significant proportion of London's children were still in the city or had returned to it, and the experience of the Blitz was therefore also, inescapably, a children's experience. Children learned with the speed and the practicality that children bring to new information, when the new information is immediately relevant to their situation, which craters were safe to play in and which were not, how to identify the fins of unexploded incendiary bombs, how to collect shrapnel, the jagged fragments of anti-aircraft shells that fell back to Earth after being fired upward as the new currency of the playground. The psychologists who studied London's children during and after the Blitz found something that surprised them. The children who remained in London with their families, and who therefore experienced the bombing in the context of their parents and their homes and their known surroundings, showed fewer signs of psychological disturbance than the children who had been evacuated to safety in the countryside but had been separated from their families in the process. The bomb was frightening. The absence of the people you loved was, for a child, more frightening still. The famous stoicism, the quality that the photographs and the newsreels documented, and that the propaganda machine of the Ministry of Information promoted as evidence of a national character that the bombing could not break, was real. It simply was not what the photographs made it look like. It was not the absence of fear or grief or exhaustion or despair. It was the decision made daily by millions of individual people to continue with the activities of ordinary life in spite of those things. To open the shop, to ride the bus, to stand in the queue at the butcher's with the ration book and make conversation with the woman behind you about the raid last night while the two of you wait for your allocation of meat. To make the children's tea and check their homework and put them to bed in the shelter and sit up afterward in the dark and listen to the aircraft and feel whatever you felt, and then to get up in the morning and do it again. That was the stoicism. Not the absence of the difficulty, but the continuing in the face of it. Not the smile on the face of the woman in the photograph, but the 57 nights of shelter that happened before and after the moment the photographer arrived. Vera came out of her Anderson shelter on the morning of the 8th of October, 1940, into a street that was the same street she had gone into the shelter from. The house was standing. The kitchen was as she had left it. The unwashed plates still on the draining board, the wireless still on the counter. She made tea. She woke the children. She got them ready for school. She washed the plates that she had not washed the night before. In the evening, her husband came home from the fire station and ate the meal she had prepared from what was in the larder, and they sat for an hour in the kitchen, and she refilled the flask, and at 8:20, the siren came again. If this documentary gave you a deeper and more human understanding of what ordinary Londoners lived through during the Blitz of 1940, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, share this with someone who would find it meaningful, and write in the comments what moved you most. Until the next video.